Until Poland regained independence, the dominant art movement was the Young Poland. Its primary goal was the preservation of Polish culture, and in the process of that preservation it excluded many groups as not Polish, primarily non-Catholics. Russian and German administrations attempted the assimilation of the Polish people, but that made the pursuit of that conservation even stronger. To my knowledge, the Austro-Hungarian administration didn't do that. They just were poor there, didn't go too deeply into this. These artworks often also commented on an idea originating from poet Adam Mickiewicz that plagues us Poles to this day, especially students going through the vile education system, the idea of Polish messianism. Poland is supposedly the Jesus of nations that will die and be reborn to save Europe from the evil of Tsar, or later the Soviet Union, and is probably saving Europe from something even now. With the establishment of Poland and the fall of the empires that held dominion over it in 1918, many artists felt they no longer had to just preserve Polish culture and could now pursue more universal and multinational art movements. That hope didn't come to fruition, as Poland was still divided mentally and economically into three parts that were under different occupations, and its borders were still changing. So Poles wanted more nationalist artwork to do the unity thing. Formists originally called themselves Polish Expressionists. Expressionism was seen as suspiciously German at the time. This might have been one of the reasons why they changed their name to a neologism. Another could have been the need to separate themselves from art groups like Rebellion, a group disliked from the radicalism and expressionism. Formists presented themselves as both a national and a modernist art movement, and a continuation to Young Poland despite the very different priorities. Many formists studied under artists of the Young Poland movement like Józef Mehofer or Stanisław Wyspiański, so the idea was not entirely without merit. The formists group was from Kraków, which was a less anti-German environment compared to Poznań. Formism is part of the theories about Eastern European avant-garde art. They started later than other avant-garde movements in Western Europe and try to elaborate or expand on the fruits of these movements. Some of these Eastern movements are Czech Poeticism, Serbian Zenitism, Polish Formism, and Russian Cubo-Futurism. Since these movements were copied, mixed, and distorted from other countries, they were very cosmopolitan in nature. Formists were aware of their hybridic nature. One of the leading Polish formist theorists was Chwistek, and he wrote that Western European avant-garde art movements didn't produce great art, but they expanded consciousness of what art could be. So now Formism takes their accomplishments in experiments and actually produces great art. This experimental approach compares the artistic process to a laboratory. Formists did not explicitly say that their goal was to define a national style. It's more of a consensus by historians that it was their goal, because of how much their art referenced folklore, especially of Podhale. Maybe the reason their political views weren't expressed was seeing the group Rebellion being attacked for their anarcho-syndicalist views, making them look not patriotic enough, and the general split between ethno-nationalist Poles and more multicultural vision of an intermarium, a federation between seas, propped up by Piłsudski and his followers. One critic called their art Bolshevik ones. Four major figures of the Formist movement showed the rift that split the group from the very beginning. Pronaszko and Czyżewski created art of nationalistic character, but Witkiewicz and Chwistek had different goals. Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, sometimes referred to as WITKACY, came up with a concept that roughly translates to clear form. The subject of the art doesn't matter as much as how the artwork is done. Many things have substance, and it's not an exclusive quality to art. Exclusive quality of art is the method in which it is made, the form. Why does creating art with clear form matters? It allows one to reach a metaphysical feeling that showcases the separation from the rest of the world and the exceptionality of one's existence. This is similar to the formalism school of writing criticism that ignores the context of the artwork and analyzes its form. Part of Witkiewicz's idea behind clear form was snobbish hatred towards mass media and more reasonable hatred towards authoritarianism. He also believed that higher feelings are systematically removed from people, and only people viewing the art the way he understood it were conscious. Eventually, he stopped believing that an oil painting can achieve clear form and focused on pastel portrait that he made under the influence of Jacques for money. His pastel paintings have listed Jacques used near the signature, and eventually he started using something even stronger, tea. This isn't a joke, he started painting under the influence of different teas. To him, Formism was a last desperate attempt to create meaning, as he thought that the psychology of all of humanity is damaged and that realism no longer can become transcendental because of that change. That in this great and mechanized world, only distortion can achieve clear form. A lot of his mob-hating views started when he came back from Russia, where he took part in the February Revolution as a commissioner. Other formists adopted the focus on form over the subject too, and were opposed to naturalism, but didn't share the view of art as a way to achieve metaphysical feeling. At least not the way WITKACY saw it. They were interested in expressionism, cubism, futurism, Podhala's glass painting, and medieval art. They didn't all agree with WITKACY on clear form, but also prioritized the form the art took over the subject. They criticized the domination of literary references in the art despite using them too, often doing art showcasing Polish folklore. Despite that priority, it didn't mean their art was completely abstract, but it was supposed to be independent from reality. Leona Chwistek had a completely different theory of art and life in general. He conceptualized the multiplicity of reality, a relativistic theory on existence of four realities we are living in. Art movements that reflects one of them without mixing it in others were good. This differs to current idea that art movements are reflections of their times, and unlike other formists, he had more respect to old masters. Later he changed the view slightly, no longer believing that not mixing realities, but having one artistic reality dominate over others in painting to be the goal. According to what I have read about these realities, I believe Formism is part of the reality of ideas. He also put Futurism and most surprisingly Matisse as artists of the same reality. He studied human sight and how one image can be interpreted in multiple ways. Chwistek wrote that the point of art shouldn't be beauty but its expressive creative potential to showcase the subjective vision of reality of the author. The system of colors and forms was seen as an alternative to the writing system. Those views weren't perfectly harmonious in the group. Some formists saw aesthetic as the goal of the art more so than the new system of expression. Some sources claim that the differences between Chwistek and WITKACY were the cause of the group splitting, but that seems unlikely as there were rifts there from the beginning. WITKACY had a complex of Chwistek scholar and Chwistek had a complex of WITKACY artists, according to Różewicz. Both of these theories were a way to justify moving away from realistic art in one way or another. WITKACY believed that there might even be infinite realities and not just four, but that an artist should believe in only one truth to be good at conveying it. He had other points of disagreement with the theory, but they were emotional, used made-up words and are generally incomprehensible, or at least the task of translating from WITKACY to Polish to English is completely beyond me. Another important formist theorist is Czyżewski. He wasn't just a painter, he made formist poetry and multi-plane paintings that are now all lost and were an in-between of painting and sculpture, but way closer to painting. His Madonna is especially important when talking about formism. It gives off the vibe of naive folklore art made in the small village, while at the same time experimenting with its forms and depth. Czyżewski is debatably the only formist poet. His style of writing was inspired phonetically by Futurism and Dadaism, but had a neutral view of modern life. Displayed it in strange ways by mixing optimism and catastrophism instead of glorifying it like Futurism did. Czyżewski's goal was to challenge structures of logic in poetry and create new ways of forming associations. He thought most poetry was too logical. Critics say that his poetry is multiplane in a similar way his paintings are. His poems had compositions. One of the poems was inspired by WITKACY's Green Eye and had the same title. One of the critics analyzing him described formism as a way of deconstructing reality and then reassembling it within its own rules. He's described as an initiator of avant garde in Poland that didn't play a breakthrough role in it. Czyżewski was said to be someone shy who had nothing else in his life but art. He made his art fast, sometimes exhibited before it dried. Anxious it would no longer be relevant in the speed of the city. I have researched claims of mental illness in Czyżewski, but not enough to say anything conclusive. I didn't know where to put this, but Chwistek fenced and cut an ear off someone who was anti-Semitic towards his soon-to-be wife, and his most famous painting is called Fencing. In the short documentary series, his daughter explains his technique in a fairly excited tone. His wife is in many of his paintings. A common motif in formist painting was dance, which is one of the reasons why the artists were commonly described as futurists, because of their portrayal of movement and simplification of forms. A lot of art was inspired by formist dancer Rita Saccheto. Her dance and pantomime were described as movement paintings. Supposedly the way she moved in combination with masks could abstract the fact that her dance was performed by a living person. Another important motive in Formism was that of the city, especially with Chwistek painting multiple visions of what these cities would look like. They were based on oblique lines. His sketch of a hotel in Zakopane was supposedly within technical possibilities of the time. This fascination with the city reflects Futurism, but it is clear that it isn't a one-to-one copy, and Formist cities are significantly different from Futurists. Despite being seen as the continuation of the art movement Young Poland, Formist art wasn't shown in the 1921 Polish art exhibition in France. Apparently Formists weren't seen as Polish enough because of their influences. Maybe it was better for them at the time. The expo that attempted to showcase Polish tradition and cultural relevance was rushed and chaotic. The French art critics mostly focused on seeing their country's influence on Polish art. France was seen as the cultural center of the world at the time. In 1922, the Formists finally had their chance to showcase their vision of the future of Polish art to the people of France. The French hated it. The French press saw in Formists a delayed reaction lacking in originality. They questioned if it fitted the exposition, named after the Young Poland. It reminded them of German artwork that they saw as their enemy. At the same time, in different parts of the exposition, the art of Poles who were working in France was met with some praise. Later that year, the group dissolved because of the creative differences. However, I can see these reviews having some influence on that. Important critic of the Formist art movement, the writer Karol Iżykowski, pompously titled his criticism "Fight for Substance." He took Formism and Futurism as one art movement to the lament of WITKACY, since both prioritized experimentation on form over substance. Chwistek later said that anyone who draws movement these days is called a futurist. WITKACY saw Futurism as too mechanical, and it didn't have the goal of invoking a metaphysical feeling. Iżykowski saw form as a container for substance or something that can only elevate it. He pointed out the deeper feeling like Aristotelian catharsis as grounded in reality. He thought Formism is atomizing meaning in art that should appear in large quantities and wanted critics to focus on the substance and not the psychology of the artist. As confusing as he saw WITKACY's writing, he believed it had some resonance after all because it had some ties to reality. Beatrice Żukotyńska writes about WITKACY in her review of Iżykowski's criticism that WITKACY failed as art theorist but succeeded as an artist because of the difference between his theories and art. Formism was spread through exhibitions and publications in the magazines Maski, meaning masks, and Wianki, meaning wreaths. However, these were visually anachronistic to the program, and warm reception to the catalog of their exhibitions gave them the idea to make their own periodically appearing magazine called Formiści, meaning the Formists. Originally, it was meant to be a monthly publication, but the economic state of Poland, still recovering from not existing for 123 years, and the Great War, put a dampener on those ambitions. The first 5 magazines had the reproductions of Formist art, articles and writings from Kraków and Paris due to the interest of Czyżewski. The 6th one was different. It had an overview of emerging artistic movements in Europe. Interestingly enough, they were impressed with art from Soviet Russia by Vladimir Tatlin and Wasyl Kandinsky, despite 2 years of Polish-Russian war, and to be honest, Russia is just always seen as an enemy. This interest was probably directed from the magazine Der Aratat, published in Monachium. This magazine later published an overview of Formism. It wasn't the only foreign magazine with interest in the movement. In the overview, there is supposedly a claim that Tytus Czyżewski in 1905 already did Cubist art before Matisse and Picasso, which he supposedly had met personally. I was unable to verify this, but Chwistek claimed that critics did call his older art Cubist, though he saw Czyżewski as someone of stronger character than Picasso, who he thought as someone who follows trends from Paris. Chwistek also saw Cubism as folk art because it was copying from traditional African art, and because of that he thought of the movement as regressive. Formists exchanged ideas with the Spanish magazine Ultra. Some articles were just copied from one to the other, though Ultra's articles on Formism were printed after the group had split. Many Formists went to other Polish art groups like Rytm, Presence, Down or Unicorn. Rytm was much more successful at the time, aiming more towards France than Germany. They were more nationalist and snobist. Chwistek wrote retrospectively, Formism was and has remained the most restrained form of imaginative art. It shaped reality in its own way, but without defining it, plucking at it, trying to grasp it by the head, overcoming it and throwing it at the service of artistic experience. Neither did Formism aspire for the rediscovery of its hidden secrets or eradicating it. It was and has remained naive and primitive, and this is where its greatness lies. The difference between Chwistek's view of art as something beautiful and enjoyable and WITKACY's view of fighting against the mechanized world is staggering, considering it's supposedly the same art movement. Further, Chwistek wrote, "It did not contribute any theoretical innovations, and that is why perhaps it had almost no effect on other trends. It had no exploratory character. Its creative values were of purely artistic nature, hence by necessity they were the most difficult to grasp and the least impressive. Today, when we look at copies of paintings of that time and compare them with the output of Cubist, Futurists, Expressionists and Suprematists, we must say that what we see is mildly idyllic, full of inner harmony and serenity, though to most of the Poles it seemed monstrous perversion and malicious crime. Later in his life, he moved to more spontaneous anti-capitalist art, where he saw it as a new way to create social bonds, a life art of the communities as opposed to individualism, opposing capitalist art that was a narcotic for the masses. In 1938, he wrote why, in his opinion, post-war modernist movements died. It was in reality a movement of suppressed spontaneous creative impulses, demanding a right to life without understanding that it went to fight for abstract slogans made before war by extreme individualists. That paradox is the reason why it died. Left-leaning, avant-garde expressions becoming upper-class art was the issue he saw in these movements. After Formism, he made his own theories of art and philosophy, acknowledging these issues and attempting to move past them. He believed that the essence of art doesn't exist, and any attempt at defining what art is will always be harmful to what art could be. He wanted to destroy all metaphysical conceptions of art. WITKACY's retrospection on Formism was far less cheerful. He later created a sarcastic pure plagiarist manifesto, a mocking made-up art movement to argue that art should be ungenuine, uninterested in social changes, because you can lie regardless of context, and all art is successful, and that women and men are equal except women are better. This new movement borrows terminology from Chwistek, but without understanding it, and not to multiple ways Formists interpreted the same vague words, which made the movement incoherent. The whole thing is an embarrassing read, and I feel comfortable calling Stanisław Ignacy WITKACY Witkiewicz a cringelord and even a buffoon. Formist lack of program and general vagueness leads some art historians to question whether Formism can be even called an artistic movement. Some say that it can be only classified as an art group, and that views of artists inside of it weren't making a logical whole. A lot of art movements are of course vague and contradictory and have some variety within them. The question is, if there is enough of a connection within Formist art to call it a movement. I say if they call themselves one, they might as well be one. Today, Formism has very little cultural relevance. It's a footnote, usually in the context of WITKACY or the 20 years between wars. Some even claim that WITKACY had not much of an influence in the direction art went himself. Even in Polish art high school, not a lot of attention was put into it, at least the one I went to. Clearly, the quest to define a national style has failed, if they even wanted that. During communist Poland, what little was said about it was negative. It was marked as a bourgeois, nihilistic art movement. WITKACY is pretty famous for a dead artist in Poland, and even in this case, many critics say that he wasn't a Formism in a manner that could suggest they believed he was better than the movement. Probably only art historians remember they existed, and some of them question the validity of calling Formism an art movement. And many of the articles I've read showed implicit or explicit disinterest in using Formism as a lens to view art through, and opted to use Cubism and Futurism instead. In 1999, a short series of documentaries aired on TVP1 called Futurist Formism New Art by Tadeusz Król. It wasn't a great watch, and it doesn't have a lot of views on YouTube, showing the interest in the subject is rather low. If Formism is an art movement, it's the only one that ever started in Poland. One of the few Formists that survived the war, Zygmunt Radnicki, came back to the style according to certain critics, and despite being forced to conform with socialist realism of communist Poland, he still did some paintings clearly influenced by the movement. In the 1980s, WITKACY's corpse was recovered from Ukraine and brought to Poland, except they buried some random Ukrainian woman instead, and didn't tell anyone about the mistake to not upset the relations between communist Poland and the Soviet Union.